Hi everyone, it's Katrina.
Eridu, the first city. Among the most ancient ruins in all of Mesopotamia is a city called Eridu. This place was considered to be the very first city in the world by the ancient Sumerians. It was founded in roughly 5400 BC and was believed to have been created by the gods themselves. The Sumerians believed that when the great gods descended from heaven, they built Eridu from stone and allowed the humans of Earth to occupy it. The later kingdoms that would rise in Mesopotamia looked back at the city of Eridu as being from a kind of lost golden age, like how we look back today at the Garden of Eden as a mythical paradise. The city was ultimately abandoned in 600 BC and has continued to deteriorate since then. But the really mysterious part of Eridu is the theory about it being created by the gods. There are a lot of fringe theories surrounding what this may have meant. Was it literal or metaphorical? Did the Sumerians think of their first kings as godly figures, or did they really believe a mysterious group of deities came down from the sky to build the first city on Earth? If you were to ask an archaeologist, they would say it's all just myth and legend. However, some believe the first great city on our planet was indeed created by a group of intelligent beings who came down from the sky. These beings supposedly helped primitive, barbaric-like humans to form the first complex society, then took off back to the stars. It was with their help that the first city was born, and that Mesopotamia turned into the cradle of civilization. Of course, it's just a theory. Egyptian head cones. Ancient Egyptians between the years 1550 BC and 30 BC wore extraordinarily strange cones on their heads. Plenty of Egyptian art from between these years shows people wearing what almost looked like dunce caps. They were pointy cone hats, as if they had traffic pylons attached to their craniums. But because not a single physical example of one of these cones was ever found, archaeologists always wondered if they really did exist, or if they had only been an artistic style. Finally, 2 head cones have been found, marking a historical first. The cones were discovered on the skulls of 2 unknown individuals who were buried at the site of Amarna in Egypt 3,300 years ago. The cones were made of wax, were almost completely disintegrated, but they were preserved enough to show that yes, the ancient Egyptians really did wear these weird hats. Now here's something that might seem totally unrelated, but could in fact be a major revelation. We have to go back to the Anunnaki and the Ubeid figurines. These figurines of strange reptilian beings had cone-shaped heads. The figurines were always sculpted with the backs of the heads looking like upside-down ice cream cones. Some believe that the influence of these mysterious reptilian overlords continued for thousands of years after they left. The ancient Egyptians who wore bizarre cones on their heads may have been trying to mimic the reptilian humanoids that came thousands of years before them. This may have lasted until around 2,000 years ago, when people finally started to forget about the reptilians who had allegedly come down from the stars to jumpstart humanity. Then again, the weird cones could have just been a phase, like stove-top hats or beaver pelt hats. The first engineers. When we think about the greatest ancient architects in human history, we usually turn to Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Rome. But some of the greatest early engineers operated in North America. America's first sophisticated engineers were Native Americans living in northern Louisiana 3,000 years ago. At the same time Egyptians were putting wax cones on their heads, Native Americans were designing complicated cities, practicing farming, and living a near-modern lifestyle. Scientists from Washington University in St. Louis recently did some digging into the ancient Native American culture that lived along the Mississippi River. They found that the early indigenous people were highly skilled engineers and could build positively gargantuan structures within just a couple of weeks. The biggest difference between the Native Americans and the Egyptians is that those in the Western Hemisphere built their structures out of earth and mud. The Egyptians built their marvels out of stone, which is why they have survived for thousands of years. But surprisingly, the monuments in America have stood the test of time as well, more or less. These university students recently looked at earthworks that have been standing for 3,000 years. Take the Poverty Point World Heritage Site as an example. It boasts a 72-foot-tall earth mound and a surrounding area of lumps that are thought to have been homes and buildings. These things all go back 3,400 years and were done with extremely primitive instruments. Unfortunately, we don't really know what happened to these indigenous people. They appear to have abandoned their great cities and allowed the earth mounds to slowly melt back into the mud. We don't know if they had gotten their inspiration for these marvelous building projects from the intergalactic travelers, or if they were just really clever. The Ubeid Reptilians. The city of Eridu was built during the Ubeid period, a time in Mesopotamian prehistory that lasted from between 5500 BC to 3900 BC. It was during this time that the prehistoric people of ancient Mesopotamia began sculpting strange lizard models known as the Ubeid figurines. These small sculptures were formed in the likeness of humanoid reptiles. They looked like creatures with bodies like ordinary men and women, but with heads like lizards. The largest bulk of these figurines were found by archaeologist Harry Reginald Hall in 1919. They were discovered at the site of Al-Ubaid, which was a city just as ancient as Eridu. While there is no real explanation for why they were made, there is one strange theory that scientists refuse to discuss, and it has to do with the group of reptilian beings known as the Anunnaki. Like we talked about before, there is a possibility that beings greater and more intelligent than us came down from the stars at the beginning of civilization. These beings are said to have given humans great knowledge, helped build the first cities, and were looked upon as gods. But also keep in mind that the Anunnaki were a real pantheon of gods, but modern sci-fi theories have changed them. The Ubeid figurines appear to be miniature recreations of what these Anunnaki creatures/gods looked like. They were reptilian lizard men who had great influence over early humans and were immortalized by the first civilizations of Mesopotamia. Advanced Inca Design. The great city of Machu Picchu was built in the 15th century by the Inca. It became one of the main citadels of the Inca civilization and is located high up in the mountains in a seemingly impossible place to build such a monumental complex. One of the more mysterious things about Machu Picchu is that archaeologists aren't really sure why it was built. They think it could have been founded around 1450 and may have been built for the great Inca Emperor Pachacuti. Around 100 years after it was constructed, it was abandoned. One of the most impressive things about the city is the fact that it was built on a mountain that suffers from severe weather events. It's a seismically active area, volatile with high winds, intense flooding, and frequent mudslides. It was the absolute worst place to build a structure of stone, and yet the Inca did it perfectly. The Inca were so brilliant that they knew exactly which materials to use to absorb floodwater while also being malleable enough to withstand seismic activity. How in the world they knew these things is beyond anyone's understanding. It seems crazy to think that the Inca just knew instinctively how to protect their buildings from an earthquake at the top of the mountain. Nonetheless, the wisdom was there, and the city still baffles and impresses scientists to this day. Sound as a weapon. One of the most creative inventions of ancient humans had nothing to do with architecture at all. Sound as a weapon was an ingenious invention that's been used ever since human beings went to war with each other. Over the ages, we have created a myriad of ways to terrify our enemies using sound. It began with war cries. The very first barbarian warriors cried out as loudly as they could to strike fear into the hearts of their enemies. As time went on, people developed more sophisticated ways of scaring people with their screams. There was the Carnix, a Celtic war trumpet that made a horrific sound like a dragon shrieking. It was so effective against the Romans that they began using their own version themselves when riding into battle to intimidate their enemies. On the other side of the world in China, screaming arrows called xiaojian were created. These arrows made a very specific screeching sound when they were shot from horseback archers. It was a noise so stringent, it sounded like tormented ghosts were streaking across the battlefield. War with the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki are considered by many to be the ancient reptilian overlords who came down to Earth to spread wisdom and ingenuity to the human race. However, some believe the Anunnaki were evil. There is a theory that claims the Anunnaki used nuclear weapons thousands of years before Americans ever dropped bombs during World War II. Author and expert on ancient history Chris Hardy says the Anunnaki used nuclear weapons on 5 major cities in the Jordan Plain. This would result in the sudden and devastating end of the Sumerian civilization. The story of these explosions and the complete nuclear meltdowns of ancient cities can be found everywhere from the Book of Genesis to Mesopotamian clay tablets. There is even physical evidence in the form of atomic skeletons. The atomic skeletons were found in the ancient city of Mohenjo-Daro, dated back to 2500 BC. The ancient city was rediscovered in the 1920s, and the whole place appears to have been obliterated by some kind of disaster. It looks as if an atomic blast went off, leveling the area and dissolving rocks at temperatures of thousands of degrees Fahrenheit. Skeletons discovered here supposedly give off radiation, which some believe is a lingering effect of a nuclear blast over 4,000 years ago. China's Grand Canal system. Egypt and Mesopotamia were not the only places that may have been visited by the Anunnaki. China may have also been blessed by strange entities from beyond the atmosphere. We know this because just like other civilizations around the world, the Chinese civilizations very abruptly became engineering geniuses over 3,000 years ago. Mysterious sculptures of alien-like creatures have also been discovered in the lost city of Sanxingdui. They are depicted as beings with large eyes that look strangely reptilian. Maybe they were visited by the same creatures as the Sumerians, or maybe it's all just one big coincidence. Whatever the case may be, China became very technologically advanced very quickly. One of their best works was the Grand Canal, a waterway that's been used consistently for 2,500 years. It still links several different Chinese cities and is currently the largest man-made waterway in the entire world. It's over 1,100 miles, something that would be a nightmare in today's age to build. The canal connects the Yellow River with the Yangtze River and passes through 4 Chinese provinces. It starts in Beijing and ends in the city of Hangzhou. People are amazed by the clever engineering and dedication it would have taken to build. Everyone remembers the Romans building similar things 2,000 years ago, but they weren't the only ones. And nobody thinks the Romans were helped by aliens. The Anasazi Cannibals. The Anasazi, also known as the Pueblo people of the southwestern United States, occupied the Chaco Canyon region for over 2,000 years. Although they lived in the region for a good amount of time, they only really hit their stride in the year 850. Then, they mysteriously vanished off the face of the earth without a trace by the year 1250. To this very day, nobody knows why they suddenly disappeared or where they went. But there's another mystery here that sits in the forbidden chapters of American history. There is one site in particular that archaeologists find haunting. It's called Cowboy Wash, and it's a ruined Anasazi village where researchers came across 7 dead bodies. These corpses were shocking because they showed signs of cannibalism. The bodies were discovered in 1993 during a supervised archaeological survey looking to build a new irrigation system. The ancient Anasazi dwellings here date back to roughly 1125. Over 1,100 bone fragments were found from just about every single piece of the human body. Many of the bones were broken, and many appeared to have been munched on. Bioarchaeologist Patricia Lambert from Utah State University reconstructed the fragments into complete bodies. She believes they belong to 3 adult males, a single adult female, and 3 children as young as 7 years old. Their bones showed obvious signs of being cut apart. There were also knife marks on muscle attachment sites, evidence of tendons being sliced, and soft tissue being carved like one might carve a dead pig. The sick mystery is trying to figure out why 7 people were picked apart bone by bone and eaten. Scientists are still trying to learn if all of the Anasazi were cannibals or just those living in Cowboy Wash. Advanced astronomy. Some of the oldest cave paintings in the world show an unbelievable knowledge of astronomy, and nobody is really sure why. Cave art across Europe shows star constellations in the night sky, and even events like comet impacts. There is also evidence in the cave paintings that suggest 40,000 years ago, Human beings were keeping track of time by watching how the stars slowly moved across the sky. It's a little confusing, and historians are doing their best to make sense of it. A group of researchers from the University of Edinburgh recently looked at cave art at sites in Spain, France, Germany, and Turkey. They discovered that every single site used the same method for tracking dates and time, all based on a sophisticated understanding of astronomy. This baffled the researchers because France is a world away from Turkey, and it's unlikely primitive humans would have had contact with one another at such a vast distance. The question then becomes, how did prehistoric humans, following the extinction of Neanderthals, learn how to read the stars and tell time? It's a complete anomaly, and so people have once again come up with the solution of the Anunnaki. There are some who believe the Anunnaki arrived on Earth 100,000 years ago, and then created human beings to be their genetic slaves. This would make sense why there were so many different kinds of hominins, as the Anunnaki tried to create the best animal possible. Then, once they had Homo sapiens and got rid of the Neanderthals, they started teaching us the ways of the universe and the mysteries of the stars. The year without a summer. One of the most devastating natural events occurred in the summer of 1816. It was known as the year without a summer. All across New England there was cold and darkness, while snow and rain fell throughout Europe. It boggled historians for centuries, and at the time, most people believed the end of days had come and the world was about to end. But just how bad was it? Well, it was extremely bad. There was almost no sunshine for a full year. The crops were terribly hard to grow because frost never left the ground. Food became suddenly scarce. People couldn't feed themselves since farming was almost impossible. Nobody could get around anywhere because all the horses died, and Europe was left in shambles. Historians say that the riots of 1816 and 1817 proved to be the worst violence in Europe since the French Revolution, with people who carried flags reading bread or blood. And because nobody understood what was happening, they blamed those in charge. Oddly enough, the same thing happened over 1,000 years earlier in the year 536, when the world went dark for a full 18 months. This phenomena wasn't because of any godly or paranormal intervention. It was actually quite scientific and related to something that happened on the other side of the world. In 1815, the volcano at Mount Tambora on the Indonesian island of Sumbawa erupted. It was the largest eruption since the one that caused the Great Darkness of 536. It was made even worse by the fact that Mayon, a volcano in the Philippines, erupted the year prior in 1814. All that volcanic activity ejected such preposterous amounts of ash into the atmosphere that the sky was completely black, blocking out the sun, its light, and its warmth. Burning Mountain. Scientists generally agree that early humans, or hominins, learned how to use fire roughly 1 million years ago. Fuel, oxygen, and heat are the three ingredients needed to create a flame and keep it burning. Theoretically, if a fire never ran out of these resources, it could burn forever. So long as a heat source triggers a combustion reaction to ignite the fuel never runs out, and the oxygen which keeps it burning stays stable, a fire could realistically burn on until the end of time. And that brings us to Eastern Australia, to Mount Wingen in New South Wales. Here, a fire has been burning for at least 5,500 years. At least those are the confirmed years. Geologists say it could have been burning for a total of 500,000 years. Long before humans ever shuffled out of caves, this fire ignited and it never stopped burning. It's appropriately called Burning Mountain, and wisps of sulfurous smoke have been seen rising from the blaze ever since people have lived in Australia. In fact, the fire has been burning so intensely for so long that the surrounding 53,800 square feet has been turned into a red and withering hellscape. The fire itself is underground and shows absolutely no signs of stopping. Researchers believe that thousands of years ago, an underground coal seam was exposed to the surface of the Earth, struck by lightning, and set to smolder. Ever since, a gently writhing fire has been gradually eating at that coal seam at about 3 feet per year. Today, the fire has moved to 100 feet below ground and is still munching on the bed of coal, its toxic discharge seeping out through fissures at the surface. Unexplained Lights. On September 7, 2021, Mexico was hit by a 7.0 magnitude earthquake. Interestingly, the earthquake itself wasn't the strange phenomenon that day, but rather a series of bizarre blue and red lights that lit up the sky. The ground quaked and the sky flared as if the clouds had been lit on fire. It was so terrifying that the locals thought the apocalypse was coming, while people panicked in the streets and ran for the safety of their homes. The epicenter of the quake was near the city of Acapulco, but it was felt all the way in Mexico City, over 200 miles away. The lights appeared brighter near the center, and scientists still don't know what happened. The prevailing theory is that they were earthquake lights, also known as EQL. This is a phenomenon that's been recorded multiple times through the centuries, and almost always occurs either in the hours or minutes before dramatic seismic activity. In ancient times, people spoke about earthquake lights as if they were signs from the gods, but in modern times, they were dismissed as folklore or crazy illusions. It wasn't until recently when people started videotaping everything, and scientists had to come to the conclusion that earthquake lights were in fact very real. But that hasn't helped scientists to figure out what in the world they are. Some researchers say the apocalyptic light show could be the byproduct of the Earth's magnetic field being disrupted by tectonic stress. Another theory, which came about in a study published back in 2014, claims the lights happen when certain rocks release energy due to seismic activity. This is why people literally see blue flames emerging from the ground, because there are rocks releasing massive amounts of visible energy. At the end of the day, these are all just theories, and nobody knows for sure what earthquake lights really are. Chile's giant sinkhole. In late July of 2022, scientists in Chile were left baffled when an enormous sinkhole bigger than a tennis court opened up in the middle of the Atacama Desert. The hole was measured by experts at 104 feet across and over twice as deep, making it an absolutely gargantuan hole. It's almost perfectly circular and looks like a borehole made by some kind of giant alien digging machine. It appeared over the weekend near a copper mine north of Santiago, and nobody's entirely sure how or why it happened. The hole was seen as such a dangerous threat that a huge security perimeter was immediately set up around it. There was some speculation that the hole had something to do with a large mine located just a few feet from it, but the mining firm, London Mining, says they don't have a clue what happened. It hasn't impacted the personnel or the infrastructure of the mine, and it seems to be totally unrelated. In the words of Cristian Zuniga, the mayor of the local town of about 13,000 people, this sinkhole is unprecedented. It's lucky nobody happened to be walking over the area when the hole appeared. Otherwise, they would have fallen into a seemingly bottomless pit and almost certainly died. It's scary to think that at pretty much any time, a hole could swallow the earth and anything in its way. Global tsunamis. On August 12, 2021, there was a 7.5 magnitude earthquake underneath the South Sandwich Islands. This is a British overseas territory, an uninhabited group of islands. 3 minutes after the initial earthquake, there was another massive tremor of 8.1 magnitude. These kinds of earthquakes aren't that unusual. The only strange thing about the event was that a powerful tsunami followed the second quake. It was so beastly that it was measured in 3 different oceans: the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Indian. It wasn't a destructive tsunami, but it was the first one since the catastrophe of 2004 to be recorded in 3 oceans simultaneously. What scientists are trying to understand now is why. They can't seem to figure out how certain types of earthquakes cause tsunamis and others don't. It should have something to do with depth. When an earthquake happens extremely deep, it usually isn't sufficiently powerful enough to flex the seafloor and create a massive tidal wave. And yet, this earthquake did exactly that, pushing a tidal wave out in 3 directions. If it had been significantly larger and stronger, those tidal waves could have decimated 3 coastlines and possibly killed hundreds of thousands of people. According to Judith Hubbard, a structural geologist from Singapore, the tsunami detection systems we're currently using might not be good enough because, unfortunately, scientists still may not have a strong grasp on the intricacies of our own planet. What this means is that the next tsunami could happen quickly and without warning, and be the worst natural event of our lifetime. Thors Well. Thors Well off the coast of Oregon is one of the most unique and spectacular natural phenomena on the Pacific coast. It can be found just off the side of the Oregon Coast Highway. The reason it's so spectacular is that even from the road, you can see the water of the ocean gushing down into a huge hole in the rock. Thors Well is a very old sea cave that collapsed a long time ago, creating something like a drainage pipe to the ocean. For those who don't know what they're looking at, it appears to be a bottomless chasm gurgling seawater as waves crash in and out. As soon as one wave smashes into the well, the water gets pushed out and violently sprays before it is immediately swallowed back up by the hole. Even though it looks like a gigantic pit, it's actually only around 20 feet deep. And while it's one of Oregon's best natural wonders, it's also extremely dangerous. During high tide and storms, when the water is particularly violent, onlookers run the risk of being pushed off the basalt rocks near the hole and dragged into it. If somebody falls into Thors Well, that's pretty much the end of them. The aggressive water will trap them in an unending maelstrom of foam and water as they get pushed down to the bottom of the hole and then spat out again. Living stones of Romania. There is an unusual geological formation near the small Romanian town of Costesti. Gigantic boulders known as trovants have mesmerized and intrigued the locals for centuries. These bulbous boulders have an almost organic shape. They seem to ooze like wet cement, and legend has it that they can grow and move as if they had minds of their own. Each boulder varies greatly in size and shape. Some are so small you could put them in your pocket, while others loom over 15 feet tall. There are hundreds of them, and they are spread out across at least 20 places in Romania. However, the most famous trovants are found in Costesti, when the sand was quarried away and the magnificent living stones were revealed. But are these stones actually alive? Do they move and grow like the locals say? The truth is that they most likely don't move on their own. Some of the rocks even have solid bases, proving that there is no way they can just roll around. As for how they were formed, scientists say it likely happened during a series of earthquakes 6 million years ago. The immense earthquakes caused sand grains to get stuck together with natural limestone cement, and they formed concretions of solid rock. The living stones get their spheroid shapes because of extremely long-lasting seismic activity, with shock waves literally pounding sandy sediments and limestone into impossible circular lumps. The Ice Volcano. In 2021, an unbelievable ice volcano emerged in Kazakhstan. Years of hot spring water gushing out of the thick layer of ice has created this natural phenomena in the Almaty region. It wasn't a small volcano either, standing an estimated 45 feet tall. According to scientists, it was all thanks to seemingly impossible meteorological conditions lining up perfectly to create one of the strangest natural wonders ever seen. At the time the volcano formed, the temperatures plummeted way below freezing in the Almaty region. The ground was covered in a thick and solid layer of ice and snow, but then a crack in the earth released hot water from an underground spring. The water sprayed into the atmosphere, was frozen by the chilly air, and then fell back to the surface as chunky ice. Over time, the frozen water created a vertical funnel just like that of a volcano. Of course, an ice volcano and a real volcano are two very different things. The ice volcano doesn't have any lava spewing out of it, and was more like a hot water fountain. It forms pretty much every year, making it one of the most popular travel destinations for Kazakh locals in the winter. Slope Point. In New Zealand, Slope Point is as south as a person can get. It's the southernmost spot on South Island, and it's home to some extraordinarily unusual trees. The trees are so oddly shaped, it looks as though they should be in a Van Gogh painting. Maybe they were pushed back by an angry wind and then stuck like that. It looks, in pictures, like they were drawn onto the landscape with pastels. The strange trees are perched at the top of some rugged cliffs, which descend straight into the ocean. At this spot, cold, harsh wind is a ceaseless thing. All day, every day, brutal winds rip across the cliffs and push back everything that grows in the windy landscape. It's these winds that have left a huge patch of trees perpetually mangled. They stretch sideways at an angle instead of straight up, and their branches are all contorted at unusual angles. But this begs the question, how did these trees survive at all with this raging wind? They were planted by sheep farmers who needed to protect their flocks from the savage weather. The wind comes up from the Antarctic Ocean uninterrupted and unimpeded, so that every day is practically hurricane season. Milky Seas. People have been reporting a strange natural event out at sea ever since the days of ancient mariners. The event is quite unusual in that suddenly and without warning, a large area of sea up to 6,000 square miles will grow translucent. And almost always, the translucent glow is a thick and soupy shade of blue. It looks as if the glow-in-the-dark liquid spilled into the ocean. The weird patch of glowing water beams so brightly that in 2005, scientists witnessed the event from satellites in orbit. These events are called Milky Seas. In 2015, the National Institute of Oceanography found that the glowing waves were the result of a bacterium. Tiny microorganisms called Noctiluca scintillans, also known as sea sparkles, glow brightly as they float on the surface of the ocean. It's like an algae bloom, but one that's incredibly rare. Brazilian prison town. The Brazilian village of Dois Rios is home to about 90 residents. The village has no grocery store, not a single church, and is in the midst of being swallowed by the jungle. It's over 100 miles from Rio de Janeiro, positioned on a mostly virgin island known as Ilha Grande. But while this place may look like a jungle paradise, in truth it has a dark and haunting past. Many of the buildings are abandoned and filled with tropical vegetation. The old soccer pitch has turned into a grove of trees, and the main square of the city is gradually becoming a meadow. Prior to 1884, the village was home to an estimated 5,000 enslaved people brought to Brazil from Africa. These people worked the sugarcane fields and coffee plantations. In 1888, slavery was abolished in Brazil. Local authorities purchased the island and turned it into a prison. According to Associate Professor Gelson Rosentino with Rio de Janeiro State University, prison islands were all the rage at that time. In the second half of the 19th century, all the best prisons were on islands, from Alcatraz to Pianosa. The tropical island remained a prison until deterioration and prisoners' rights organizations caused it to be gradually abandoned. By 1994, most of the prison complex was destroyed. Because the community on the island had relied on the labor of the prisoners to live, conditions quickly grew dire. Food supplies dwindled, the school shut down, and the houses fell into disrepair. There are still a few people on the island now, but the town is slowly fading away. Tomb of the deposed emperor. Liu He was one of the worst emperors in Chinese history. He ruled during the Han Dynasty, installed as the emperor in 74 BC. But just 27 days after he was made emperor, he was deposed and scratched off the list of official emperors. There were supposedly 1,127 examples of misconduct placed against him, and he was banished. Emperor Liu He was such a disgrace that he was exiled to live life as a commoner. He died about 20 years later, though his bloodline lived on through his 22 children. Even though he was banished, he still had 16 wives. We don't know what happened that made the emperor shamed so publicly. Many of the records surrounding his life were intentionally destroyed to erase him from the history books. But here's where the mystery thickens. The deposed emperor's tomb was discovered in the northern part of Xinjiang in 2011. Archaeologists entered his tomb and discovered over 20,000 artifacts. Even though he was supposedly banished to life as a peasant, he was buried in a massive grave filled with jade artifacts, gold and bronze, and 5,000 pieces of bamboo slips written with the wisdom of Confucius. Clearly, the emperor was still important enough to be buried with an insane amount of riches. What he did to be banished, why he was still important upon his death, and why his name was nearly scrubbed from history is unknown. Garden of the Hesperides. Lixus was once a major Phoenician city alongside the river Lukos, right at the edge of the Atlantic Ocean. The mysterious city in modern Morocco was supposedly the site of a mythical garden from which golden apples grew in abundance. This was the mythical place out of antiquity called the Garden of the Hesperides. Legends say the garden was tended by magical nymphs. It was also the place in Greek mythology where Hercules had to travel to kill the Ladon dragon, which protected the garden from trespassers. Today, the city of Lixus is little more than a ruin. Its streets have turned to dust. The Temple of Hercules is a crumbling mess of stone, and the Roman theater has been abandoned for centuries. The old channels that once brought running water to the inhabitants are dry, and there is no sign of the mythical garden said to have gifted the residents with delicious golden apples. Great Zimbabwe. The ancient city of Great Zimbabwe was supposedly one of the most impressive metropolises on the planet. Modern archaeologists agree it was an engineering wonder of the ancient world. However, the archaeologists of the past credited the African city to the Phoenicians or Babylonians. No one could believe such a grand place was built by Africans. This was a major issue with archaeology prior to these most recent decades. People who were supposed to be brilliant scientists were ignorant to the history of Africa, and racist, believing any great ruins found on the continent were built by the Arabians or wandering tribes of Mesopotamians. We now know that was very wrong. There is no better example of how wrong the old explorers were than Great Zimbabwe. It was a megalithic city built of stone between roughly 1100 and 1450 AD in Zimbabwe. It was likely the work of the Shona culture, whose descendants make up much of the local population to this day. But it may have also been built by other neighboring societies who migrated to the city looking for a better life. 600 years ago, Great Zimbabwe had roughly the same number of people living in it as London, England. The city grew wealthy through trade, and they were positioned to receive caravans from Arabia, India, and China. Unfortunately, we don't know what happened here in the end. After 350 years of unparalleled prosperity, this city was abruptly abandoned. It's now nothing but a ruin, with the busted fragments of the old royal city, mud brick houses, large walls, and conical towers littering the site. There are also the ruins of over 200 smaller settlements and trading posts in the surrounding area. China's secret pyramid. China supposedly has a gigantic pyramid that dates back 8,000 years. This mysterious pyramid is top secret and rumored to be guarded by the military. Whispers of the structure go back to at least 1912. That was when Fred Meyer Schroeder, an American trader, was traveling through the Shanxi province. He wrote in his diary that he witnessed a pyramid standing roughly 1,000 feet tall and twice as wide. He also claimed it was surrounded by a group of smaller pyramids. 3 decades later, U.S. Air Force pilot James Gossman witnessed a pure white pyramid while flying over China that he claimed was twice the size of the Great Pyramid of Egypt. When the German investigator Hartwig Hausdorff traveled to China in the 1990s, he couldn't find it. Instead, he encountered the Chinese military patrolling the area. No one has ever been able to take a clear picture of this pyramid, and no mainstream archaeologists have been invited to investigate. The pyramid is supposedly kept a major secret by China, but nobody understands why. Maybe it's a royalty thing, with China not wanting to disrupt the graves of buried rulers from centuries past. Or maybe it's something even weirder. Do you think China is hiding a pyramid? Let me know in the comments below. Dragon's Triangle. The mysterious Dragon's Triangle is the Japanese version of the Bermuda Triangle. In Japanese folklore, the triangle has been considered a dangerous and unpredictable zone for at least 1,000 years. Locals call it Ma-no Umi, which translates roughly to the Devil's Sea. The mystery is that things here seem to disappear. Sailors have reported fishing boats vanishing without a trace. Some have supposedly witnessed a dragon rise to the surface of the water, and others have seen entire crews be pulled from their boat down to the watery seabed. Between 1952 and 1954, 5 Japanese military vessels and 700 crew members allegedly disappeared within the Dragon's Triangle. The triangle itself begins in Tokyo, moves southeast to Guam, then northwest to the southern tip of Taiwan, and north again to Japan. Technically, the whole area is part of the Philippine Sea. It is a volatile and highly volcanic region known for its seismic activity. In Japanese legend, it was the Dragon's Triangle that wiped out the fleet of the Mongol ruler Kublai Khan when he tried to invade Japan in 1281. Japan was on the brink of being conquered by the Mongolians when their ships were decimated by two mysterious storms that rose without warning. Since then, the Japanese have attributed their safety to the wrath of the Dragon's Triangle, which sank 900 Mongol ships and killed 40,000 soldiers. Caves of Mystery. Outside the city of Bhubaneswar in India, there is a mysterious archaeological site called the Udayagiri Caves. The caves here are partly natural and partly human-made. They serve as temples and have been around since at least the 1st century BC. There are a total of 32 caves that began as natural caverns and were transformed by human hands into marvelous temples. All the temples except one were dedicated to the Jainism religion. Jainism is one of the oldest religions on the planet, dating back 500 years before Christianity. It is still widely practiced in India with an estimated 5 million followers. Much like Buddhism and Hinduism, Jainism promotes enlightenment and encourages people to be non-violent and respect plants and animals and speak the truth. Followers of Jainism are not allowed to steal. They cannot become attached to worldly possessions, and ideally, they are celibate. Just like how Buddhism worships the great Buddha, Jainism has its own spiritual leaders as well. There are 24 jinas who supposedly reached spiritual enlightenment and thus escaped the vicious cycle of physical rebirth. The Udayagiri caves were made by worshippers of this religion. One of the caves may have even been occupied by the legendary Queen of Lalatendu Kesari. Historians believe she may have lived in the double-storied cave with 32 cells, each one decorated with well-preserved sculptures and reliefs. Citadel Lafier. Citadel Lafier is one of the most spectacular archaeological sites in Haiti. It is an iconic and massive stone fortress located on top a jungle mountain, utterly abandoned and totally creepy. It was built purely for defense. The issue with a small island like Haiti is that building traditional coastal fortifications was not ideal. Fortresses like that would be vulnerable to any attack by sea. By building a citadel at the top of a mountain, the Haitians had a much better chance of defense. They could attack invaders trying to breach the island and had a major defensive position that would be nearly impossible to beat. But why was the citadel built at all? Construction was complete in 1820, with the whole point to protect the recently freed Haitian people. There was a real concern that the French army would come back and enslave them a second time. To prevent that from happening, they built a monumental fort to defend themselves. But the French never came back, and so its 365 cannons never got used. Temple of Seti I. One of the greatest and most mysterious temples in all of Egypt can be found in the ancient city of Abydos. It's the famous Temple of Seti I, carved out of stone 3,000 years ago. The temple originated as a necropolis for Egyptian royalty throughout the 1st and 2nd dynasties. Then it transitioned into a place of worship. It quickly became one of the top pilgrimage destinations in Egypt for the cult worship of Osiris. As the worship of Osiris became more and more popular, pharaohs continued to build more monumental structures in Abydos. The temple grew positively massive, as each Egyptian king made it better and better to show their dedication. Then, under the rule of Ramses I in the 19th dynasty, between 1290 and 1279 BC, the Temple of Seti I reached its peak. It was even home to the Abydos King List, a long gallery with the cartouches of the previous 76 ruling pharaohs. It's behind the temple that we find one of its most intriguing features. There is a large structure called the Osirion. The mystery is that no one knows what it is. The structure is behind the main temple but doesn't seem to hold any purpose. Some have suggested it was designed as a copy of a tomb from the Valley of the Kings. Archaeologists say that nowhere else in Egypt is any similar architecture found, giving them very little to compare it to. We don't know who built it, what it was for, or why its foundations are even lower than the temple in front of it. Hishams Palace. Hishams Palace was built around the year 734 AD in the Jordan Valley during the rule of Caliph Hisham ibn Abdel Malik. It's an important historical place because it was one of the very last desert palaces built in Jordan. In other words, it was one of the final pieces of ancient architecture constructed during the reign of the Second Islamic Caliphate. It's famous today for its simplistic style, its construction of sandstone and baked brick, and its classical Islamic illustrations. The mysterious ruins consist of three main parts. There is the bath complex, the agricultural estate, and the palace itself. But you might be wondering what's so mysterious about the palace. The thing that really bothers archaeologists is that they don't know who lived in Hisham's palace. There are no textual sources that reference it. We know it was a product of the Umayyad dynasty, the second caliphate to rule after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. This was a time when desert fortifications, palaces, and castles were built throughout the Jordan Desert. Each construction was usually funded by a figure within the Umayyad ruling family. But the patron of Hisham's palace is an enigma. The second mystery is that we don't know what happened to this place. It was destroyed around 749 AD, shortly after it was built. Some suggest it was an earthquake, but that's never been proven. The whole place was abandoned shortly after and then lost to the desert sands. The Jewel of Sedin. In 1976, a tractor was removing dirt from a seemingly empty field in El Salvador when suddenly it revealed the remains of a house. But this wasn't a modern house, it was ancient. Payson Sheets from the University of Colorado was called in to investigate. He soon came to the conclusion that the tractor had uncovered a lost Maya village of unimaginable proportions. Excavations began in 1988 and have continued ever since. So far, archaeologists have revealed over 70 buildings from a long-lost village that flourished over 1,000 years ago. Joya de Sedin is amazing because it offers some of the most distant proof of the Maya civilization in Central America. We know many of their most impressive cities were in southern Mexico and northern Guatemala, but it's rare to find a Maya settlement in El Salvador. This discovery proves just how widespread these people really were. The village was likely settled around the year 200 AD. It then flourished on the outskirts of the Maya civilization as a kind of backwoods agricultural community. These people would have been far away from the political turmoil happening at sites like Tikal and Chichen Itza. They may have even survived the collapse of the Maya Empire if it wasn't for what happened in 600 AD. Because the farming village was built in the shadow of the Loma Caldera volcano, an unexpected eruption buried it in ash. The whole village was subsequently lost for 1,400 years until it was rediscovered in 1976. The Face of Haraku. The Face of Haraku is a strange geological feature that nobody can seem to figure out. It was uncovered in the Amazon rainforest and has led to mass speculation and controversy. It seems to be a face carved into the side of a solid stone cliff, but it could just be a rock that looks like a person's face. The discovery was made in 2014 in the Haraku Reserve, deep in the Peruvian jungle. According to the local indigenous people, the face has always been there. For generations, natives have heard stories from their elders going back centuries of megalithic faces carved into the stone throughout the jungle. The biggest problem was that until recently, nobody knew where the faces were hiding. The large stone-carved features were more myth than anything, at least until one of them was physically found. The Face of Haraku does look like a carved human face overlooking a waterfall, with clear views down into the jungle valley. It's about 26 feet tall and is totally covered in moss. It has a prominent brow, carved smooth as if by hand, and a sharp nose. But there are no clear markings from ancient tools, and no other evidence nearby of ancient activity. Either this thing is an old guardian of the jungle, or it's all just wishful thinking, seeing a face in the stone where there isn't one. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Guayabo National Monument. Almost in the exact center of Costa Rica is a place called the Guayabo National Monument. This ancient archaeological site can be found on the slope of the mighty Turrialba volcano, surrounded on all sides by thick rainforest and overwhelmingly vibrant greenery. The forest and vegetation here thrives because of the rich volcanic soil. The site itself is little more than a ruin of what was once a powerful city. It was likely the center of a civilization that was initially inhabited around 1000 BC. The people who lived here, known as the Guayabo de Turrialba, thrived for over 2,000 years. They only abandoned the city shortly before the arrival of the Spanish for unknown reasons. To this day, scientists have never found any signs that point to why they would have left their great city. Some believe they were assaulted by a foreign disease, while others think they were destroyed by a rival civilization. But it also could have been a natural disaster that forced them to flee. The ruins of the city were found in the 1800s, with early archaeologists identifying petroglyphs and tombs, as well as the remnants of at least 43 stone buildings. The city had 3 aqueducts, providing unlimited fresh water to its inhabitants. There were 2 major highways leading in and out of the city, along with smaller footpaths that likely led to settlements farther away. All excavations prove that this was the cultural center of ancient Costa Rica, but again, we don't know what happened to them. The Guayabo survived by eating food grown in the jungle, mainly things like yucca plants. They don't appear to have been plagued by a drought like the Maya, and yet they seemingly vanished into thin air. Big thank you to Rich Raz and Wayne Miller for supporting this channel. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos about amazing history. Atlantis. A team of researchers believe they have just discovered the lost city of Atlantis, the same legendary city that was allegedly destroyed by a tsunami thousands of years ago. It was uncovered in a muddy flatland in southern Spain. According to lead researcher Richard Freund, a tsunami crashed into the Spanish coast an estimated 2,600 years ago and sent waves over 60 miles inland, utterly obliterating the city that once stood there. Richard and his international team analyzed satellite images north of Cadiz and indisputably identified the remains of a submerged city in the marshlands of Doña Ana Park. The team then used deep ground radar to further confirm the ruins of the site. They also identified smaller remnants of settlements a little farther away. Richard believes these settlements were built in the image of Atlantis by refugees following the destruction of their grand metropolis. Richard thinks these memorial cities, as he calls them, are additional evidence of Atlantis. Unfortunately, there is no way to 100% confirm that the city was indeed Atlantis. We know there was a great settlement here and that it's just been identified for the first time, but to call it Atlantis is still a little premature. However, it does seem to fit Plato's description of the city from 360 BC. Until the researchers have uncovered artifacts, ancient inscriptions, or anything that can prove their claim, Atlantis is still just a myth. The lost civilization of Matera. Matera in Italy was once home to an underground civilization hidden from the rest of the world. Underneath the southern Italian town are roughly 1,500 dwellings forming a subterranean honeycomb that spreads down the flanks of a ravine. Archaeologists believe these underground burrows were first occupied by primitive hominids in the Paleolithic period, over 12,000 years ago during the Ice Age. Then, over the next few thousand years, modern humans flocked to the caves as well. There was once a fully functioning underground society here, living in complete darkness. What's truly shocking is that Matera was home to about 16,000 people as recently as the 1950s. Even right now, there are modern people living inside the underground burrows. Only now they have electricity, heating, and indoor plumbing. But what's the deeper story here? The underground city has been occupied since Europe was overrun with cave people. Then a real city was built on top of it, with people there living in the glorious sunlight. But there has always been an underclass living beneath the streets. It was in the medieval era when Matera stopped being an ideal place to live and transformed into a hideout for people that were down on their luck. It became an underground civilization with people living in poverty. Peasants, criminals, and all kinds of undesirables retreated into the underground city and hid away from the rest of the world. It wasn't until the 1990s that the place began to transform. These days, the very caverns that were once inhabited by Paleolithic humans are now being rented on Airbnb. Would you stay here? Let me know in the comments below. Tioa. In 1848, Tioa was founded in a low valley near Lake Tarawera in New Zealand. The Church Missionary Society established Christian settlements across New Zealand in order to create mission stations. The town was founded by a man named Seymour Spencer after he was kicked out of a different village for making inappropriate advances toward young Maori girls. In other words, he wasn't the kind of guy you would want building a town for the church. However, he and his wife built the community with help from the locals. Shortly after, Spencer was once again kicked out of the town for inappropriately harassing the indigenous girls. Drama and controversy aside, Tioa thrived as a community. It was built to look like a typical English village and became a tourist attraction in the 1860s. There were a pair of hotels here as well as a blacksmith shop, and everything you would expect in a 19th century village at the edge of the world. But then, the volcano erupted. In 1886, Mount Tarawera blew its top and caused mass devastation. Multiple villages were destroyed, and many people died from debris landing on them or from choking to death on the smoke. Some took shelter in their homes, only to be buried under volcanic ash. Out of the roughly 70 homes, less than 10 remained standing after the eruption. The rest were buried under volcanic material like a modern Pompeii. The whole city is now a buried ghost town. Surkotada. The Indus Valley civilization was one of the first societies in the world that prospered on a notable level. They began spreading across Pakistan and northern India in 3300 BC, or 5,300 years ago. Along with ancient Egypt and old Mesopotamia, they were one of the 3 starter civilizations responsible for the progress of the human race. It was around 2600 BC when they reached their peak, with massive cities all across their territory. One of these cities was Surkotada, located in Gujarat, India. It was one of the smaller settlements built prior to the civilization's mysterious collapse in 1300 BC. Surkotada was founded around 2100 BC. Archaeological excavations have shown a large citadel was built here, surrounded by a fortification. There were also several residential areas that could be accessed from the citadel's 2 entrances on the southern and eastern side of the city. Over a short period of time, it morphed into a thriving hub of activity. People lived here for 400 years without pause and with no invasions. Historians believe these were mainly peaceful people, and that for 4 long centuries they lived with ample food and plenty of fresh water. But then everything changed. Archaeologists discovered a layer of ash representing a widespread fire that started around 1800 BC. Something happened that almost burned the whole place to the ground. Artifacts have shown that a different group of people began migrating into the settlement after the catastrophe. Nobody knows what happened next, but the city was abruptly abandoned shortly after the fire and the influx of new residents. And after that, the entire Indus Valley civilization came crashing down. In the end, Surkotada and their other cities were all deserted. Old Sarum. Archaeologists believe that Old Sarum is the oldest settlement in Salisbury, England. However, there is not much left of it today. Nothing but some markings and pits on the ground where the impressive city once stood. It was built on the top of a hill in the middle of nowhere, about 2 miles from the nearest road. It also happened to be close to the stone circles of Avebury and the more famous historical landmark known as Stonehenge. People lived here as early as 3000 BC, but the actual city of Old Sarum was built around 400 BC. It was an Iron Age hill fort like something straight out of a fantasy novel. It had a huge castle at the very peak of the hill, with tall defensive walls and lookout towers. The rest of the city grew around the main fortification, and over the centuries, more and more additions were installed. The city remained standing during the Roman occupation. Over time, dirt paths transformed into paved roads. The Saxons took the fortress by force in the 6th century, then turned it into an even bigger stronghold. It became one of the main defensive positions during the days of the plundering Vikings. When the Normans took control of the city, they built a Bailey castle and a massive cathedral. A palace for King Henry I was also constructed. Then, after 3,000 years of history, the city was dismantled brick by brick. The buildings of Old Sarum were picked apart and used as construction supplies for the city of New Salisbury. The whole place was eventually picked clean and forgotten about. The Dovbush Rocks Complex. The Dovbush Rocks Complex in Ukraine formed naturally between 66 and 56 million years ago, but much more recently it was used as a stone fortress. The natural rock formations were carved to resemble medieval towers and castle spires. Archaeologists have found evidence of an ancient monastery, potentially inhabited by a community of Eastern Christian monks in the medieval era. However, evidence has also been found that the site was used long before that as a natural castle by a mysterious tribe. The remains of a defensive moat were also discovered, showing the whole complex was once surrounded by a deep channel of water. Sadly, there hasn't been much archaeological research done at the Dovbush Rocks Complex. Nobody knows if it was occupied in the prehistoric days by cave people, or if the fortifications were carved out of the rock in the 13th century. Some experts have suggested it was used as a refuge for people fleeing the Mongol invasion of the 1200s. Then, in the 18th century, the complex was utilized by legendary folk hero Oleksandr Dovbush. He was like the Ukrainian version of Robin Hood, who stole from the rich and gave to the peasants. Yorkshire's lost Atlantis. Archaeologists believe they are closer than they have ever been to discovering the lost medieval town in England. The town is sometimes referred to as Yorkshire's Atlantis. The reason it's been so tough to find is because it's hiding under the water. The town's real name is Ravensthorpe, and it flourished on the eastern coast of England in the Middle Ages. Daniel Parsons, a professor from the University of Hull, says at least 400 households were in the city. This was a fairly large settlement with its own economy and its own history. It had a seawall to prevent flooding and a harbor to promote trade. It also had a prison for criminals and a bustling marketplace. But then it sank, and it's never been seen again. We know the city existed because there are historical records of it. It was founded around 1235, but the spot chosen for its construction wasn't great. The whole settlement was built on a sandbar on the northern banks of the Humber River. Within just 100 years, the coastline began to erode. Seaside buildings started falling into the water. The town flooded annually, and eventually the whole thing was submerged. Researchers believe a major storm hit Ravensthorpe in 1362, and nothing was left of it afterward. While the city hasn't been discovered yet, archaeologists believe they are getting close. They were looking for its submerged ruins in November of 2021, but they didn't find anything. However, they have narrowed down the area where it could be located. They now believe it's hiding underneath an estuary near the Humber River and hope to find it soon. The road to Atlantis. There is a mysterious sunken road beneath the water in the Caribbean, and no one can agree on why it's there. Some say the road leads to the lost world of Atlantis, gone for over 3,000 years. Others claim it's nothing but an ordinary geological feature on the ocean floor. Either way, the mystery has been teasing scientists and conspiracy theorists alike. The discovery of the mysterious road was made off the coast of the Bahamas at a depth of 20 feet. It looks exactly how it sounds, like a paved road. It goes on for about 1,500 feet and appears like it's made from handcrafted cobblestones. Each block is about 13 feet long, and there are two smaller paths carved neatly next to the main road. It really seems like the road should lead somewhere. It looks as if the Bimini Road was once part of a much larger highway. It was originally found in 1968 by archaeologist Joseph Manson and his colleagues. When they first found this miracle under the sea, they immediately thought of Atlantis. They described these stones as pieces of pavement and said they were likely part of a lost civilization. However, geologists have something different to say. They say the road is simply a natural layer of limestone, and that these stones were part of a much larger block that broke apart into shards, making it look like a cobblestone road. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Biblical Babel. According to biblical lore, Babel, or Babylon as most people know it, was the first city established by Noah after the flood. Noah had himself a quaint little farm, and then he established the city of Babel to restart humanity. That's a lot of responsibility for one guy. According to mainstream archaeologists, this city of Babylon was the center of the Babylonian Empire, founded about 4,000 years ago in 2300 BC. There was a small port city on the edge of the Euphrates River that grew to be one of the greatest places in the ancient world. Between the Bible and the archaeologists, everyone can agree we're talking about the same city. Babel, or Babylon, is about 5 miles south of Baghdad. The thing scholars can't agree on is when it was built and what really happened within the walls of the city. King Hammurabi made Babylon into a military powerhouse around 1792 BC. He used his military might to take over most of Mesopotamia. This created one of the first true empires in the world. The Bible claims Babylon was a wicked city and the site for the construction of the Tower of Babel. Humans here supposedly tried to reach the heavens by building a great tower. When God realized what they were trying to do, he destroyed their tower and broke their language into pieces so they couldn't understand each other anymore. But modern scholars say there was no Tower of Babel, only the mighty ziggurat in honor of Marduk, god of Babylon. The Lost World of the Maya. The Lost World of the Maya is far more interesting than many give it credit for. The Maya didn't only live in the jungles, but on the beaches and in the mountains. There were millions of people in the Mayan Empire, with each city acting as its own authority. Many had their own kings and queens, each governing their own region. The city-states were connected through a complex network of highways, rural roads, and watery canals. Although the Maya civilization was technically an empire, there likely wasn't a single governing body. They were united by their culture. It had such a vast kingdom, it was a daunting task to control it all. The Maya civilization emerged around the year 1000 BC. They developed a highly detailed calendar system, began to practice astronomy, and developed one of the first writing systems in Mesoamerica. The Maya Empire dominated from southern Mexico all the way to the jungles of Central America. But something changed dramatically around the year 900 AD. A study done by scientists from the University of Florida and Cambridge University recently solved the mystery of what happened to the Maya. Some had thought it was war that shattered the empire, others said it was interference from another civilization. But according to the scientists who did this study, it was the rain that killed them, or the lack of it. Scientists saw that rainfall decreased by about 50%, and within a few short years, the Maya population dropped 90%. The Sumatran City of Gold. Archaeologists in Indonesia recently uncovered the shining remains of a lost civilization at the bottom of a river. This was in Sumatra, a place that has long been a source of great mysteries. Sumatra is incredibly remote. Many people in the world don't even know where it is. Plus, it's home to thousands of animal and plant species hiding in the muddy rivers and bright green jungles. Sumatra itself is like a lost world before civilization. At least some parts of it are. But let's take a look at the discovery of this lost city. It was found at the bottom of the Musi River, off the coast of Palembang village. Researchers say it was likely the capital city of the mysterious Srivijaya Empire. This legendary kingdom came into existence around the 7th century AD and then vanished in the 14th century without a trace. Historians know it was real because this city was documented by Chinese explorers, along with other traders who came across it during the early age of exploration. The nameless city was a regional center for Buddhism and perhaps the first consolidated empire in Southeast Asia. It predates the Khmer Empire by several centuries, and yet very little physical evidence of it remains. Experts say that's because it was a floating society. The city had thousands upon thousands of floating markets, houseboats, and wooden ships, creating a metropolis in the center of the river. Fragments of the city are only now starting to be found, buried in the river sediment. Big shout out to Honey Music and Jorge Gonzalez Laramendi. Thanks so much for watching and supporting Origins Explained. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe and join the family. The Chola Dynasty. In the southern Indian state of Tamil Nadu is a temple standing tall and proud amidst paddy fields. The mysterious temple is the only remaining vestige of the grand city of Gangaikonda Kolapuram, or something like that. It doesn't seem like much today, but this temple was once part of the spectacular capital of one of the oldest dynasties in the world. Okay, wait, let me try again. Gangaikonda Cholapuram. Close enough. For almost 500 years, the Chola dynasty dominated southern India. Starting around 300 BC, the Chola influenced everything from religion to architecture. It controlled the trading system from India to Southeast Asia and into China. And yet, despite the Chola wielding massive power around the same time as the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, their history has remained largely unknown. The Mughals, who came later, gained much more infamy, and then the British after them. Researchers are now hard at work studying the ancient capital of the Chola in hopes of learning more about their culture. New excavations have started to rekindle the scientific interest in the Cholas. We're learning that they were one of the most powerful kingdoms in medieval India. They invested much of their money in art and literature. They built giant stone temples, elaborate social hubs, and figured out how to avoid drought. They even had a system to supply all their people with safe drinking water. The only visible proof that we have, though, is through the Lost City. The single standing temple is really the only thing left that proves they even existed. But in 2021, archaeologists found the first physical evidence of a palace in the ancient city. More excavations should reveal new insights into the lost world of the Chola. Lioness. According to ancient Arthurian legend, Lioness was a land of extreme fertility. Its residents were prosperous. They had great crops because of the rich soil, and they developed their own unique culture. It was in the land of Lioness where legendary King Arthur supposedly fought his great battle against Mordred. But then, in the 11th century, Lioness suddenly vanished. It was supposedly hit by a tidal wave and sank beneath the ocean in just a few hours. In the old legends, the land of Lioness stretched all the way from Land's End in the bottom western corner of England to the Isles of Scilly off the coast of Cornwall. But was there really a piece of land here where people lived 1,000 years ago? In 2016, researchers decided to find out once and for all. They did a tidal study, which was just published after nearly 7 years of work. They looked at rising sea levels on the Isles of Scilly over the past 12,000 years. The data showed that between 2,500 and 2000 BC, there was a massive loss of land. According to Charlie Johns with the Cornwall Archaeological Unit, about 2/3 of the islands were lost. The rate of sea level change did slow after that, but the landscape still continued to morph. It's entirely possible a whole world was lost because the sea level rose. The land of Lioness could really have existed, and its people may really have been swallowed by an unexpected tidal wave that washed away their houses. Pakistan's Great Lost Kingdom. Mohenjo-Daro is just as old as the cities of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, yet very few have ever heard of it. Researchers first came across its remains in 1911, only to have the Archaeological Survey of India dismiss it as nothing to be excited about. It wouldn't be until British archaeologist Sir John Marshall excavated the site decades later that it gained some fame. It finally became a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1980, and now most of the remains have been revealed. Scientists have unveiled the shocking ruins of the best preserved city of the Indus Valley civilization. Mohenjo-Daro prospered between 2500 and 1700 BC, reaching a population of about 40,000. This was a highly advanced metropolis in what is today Pakistan, with exceptional city planning and all the newest technology of the day. Most impressive of all, is that they had a sanitation system better than almost anywhere else in the world. They had private toilets for everyday citizens. Private toilets were things only rich people used, even in Western civilization until fairly recently. They also had private baths in their homes, proving just how advanced the society was. Mohenjo-Daro was abruptly abandoned almost 4,000 years ago. In 1700 BC, the Indus Valley civilization crumbled. We still don't know why. In fact, it's one of the biggest archaeological mysteries, trying to figure out how such an advanced kingdom suddenly ceased to exist. Rajasthan Ghost Village. Kuldara is a mysterious haunted village in Rajasthan, India. It's the source of a lot of creepy folklore and ghost stories, but how close the legends are to any actual truth is unknown. As of right now, Kuldara is abandoned and deserted. Nothing remains except the crusty shells of houses and other structures. So decayed, none of them have roofs or doors anymore. We know the village was likely established 700 years ago by a group of farmers, and that they prospered for a few hundred years. But then, according to legend, Prime Minister Salim Singh tried to marry a girl in the village without her consent. He threatened the villagers that if they refused to let him marry the young girl, they would face a horrible punishment. Rather than stick around to see what their punishment would be, the villagers packed up their things and left in the middle of the night. The city has been abandoned ever since, and somewhere along the way, ghost stories began to be whispered by folks from nearby towns. People from all over the world continue to visit the city to this day, hoping to sleep in the ruins and maybe even see a ghost. Would you want to do that? Let me know in the comments. Ekbalam. Ekbalam is one of the most spectacular archaeological ruins in Mexico, and yet not many people have even heard of it. The ruins can be found in the northern Maya lowlands of the Yucatan Peninsula, not far from the city of Chichen Itza. Ekbalam peaked around the 8th century AD, just before the fall of the Maya, and housed over 20,000 people. It was rediscovered in the 19th century by French archaeologist Désiré Charnay, then excavated in the 20th century, but excavations only revealed a small fraction of the site. Much about the city is still unknown, making it an intriguing mystery. The city was positively huge, with at least 45 different structures already identified. It had a grand plaza at its core. There were various tombs, courts for playing sports, and a gigantic palace where the ruler of the city lived with their family. But the biggest structure of all at Ekbalam is the Acropolis. It was here where archaeologists found the tomb of Ukit Khan Lek Tok, king of Ekbalam. The ruler was buried underneath a temple inside the Acropolis, its entrance carved into the likeness of a jaguar's mouth. Britain's megalithic landscape. There are over 900 stone circles scattered across the British Isles, and researchers say twice that number have been built by ancient people. The megalithic structures are part of a lost world, one that we can only imagine today. Stone circles, or stone rings as some prefer, started being built in England around 6,000 years ago. This was during the Neolithic period, which lasted until 2000 BC. Most people don't know about many of the stone circles in England. Everyone's heard of Stonehenge, but there's also the Avebury Stone Circle, Silbury Hill, Castlerigg Stone Ring, and many more. The truth behind these stone rings has never really been uncovered. Archaeologists suggest they were used for astronomy and astrology when they were both the same. Many of them line up with certain cosmological events like the solstices, but there's really no way of telling what motivated the Neolithic Britons to create their megaliths. All we can say with any certainty is that for an astounding 2,000 years, an estimated 1,800 stone circles were built across the British Isles. They weren't used as tombs or burial grounds. They were places of great importance, likely used to carry out strange rituals while prehistoric Britons worshipped unknown gods. They may have even been worshipping the stars themselves. What do you think life was like in ancient Britain? Let me know in the comments below, and thanks for watching! Remember to subscribe and come back soon for more amazing videos. See you later, bye!